Greetings and welcome to HillCrest Wine Club video tasting notes. So we're in our second shipment of this year, November, which we always build around Thanksgiving a little bit, and we have some beautiful flavors to kind of play along with that. And then a little bit later, we're going to release another video really highlighting the Thanksgiving special that we always do. So stay tuned for that one. The wines that we're going to taste today, we have the 2020 Les Combes Pinot Noir, which is a wine that really speaks to HillCrest, of course, because of our history with Pinot Noir and that. 2.5 years in barrel, so out there in the market, you're starting to see a lot of like 22s and that. Here, once again, we're just releasing the 20. This is being released as we speak. A wine, a really spectacular wine from an area we've tasted from before, Provence, down southeastern France, international red. That is, I had this wine and it really made me think about a couple things that I want to talk about when we taste. And then our latest release as well. So this was just released a minute ago. This is being released now. This is a Chenin Blanc. And Chenin Blanc is one of the classic grape varieties, something that in the 1970s people were very aware of and drank a lot of it in America. It was a dominant grape. That grape, there's a renaissance, and the classics are classics because they always stand the test of time. So we're seeing the return of something really beautiful. And the 2022 vintage is our first release of that. So anyway, Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir, of course, is the measuring stick of Oregon. If you go to any wine region of the world and go into a wine shop and you say Oregon wine, they would tell you Pinot Noir, even though we do a lot of other beautiful things as we know. Pinot Noir is considered a minx, one of the most difficult grapes there is, not only to grow but to make into wine. It's considered the master class kind of thing, maybe the way a souffle would be in baking. Pinot Noir for me, it's a wine that when I first got into wine, I really wasn't my favorite, and I was exposed to some really beautiful things, but I just wasn't quite ready for it. And I oftentimes use the analogy of like really complex foods that when you're young, you don't like those. We tend to like kind of simple, primary, kind of sweeter or simple flavors. The more we eat, the more we tend to kind of lean towards, at the end of the road, we're eating lamb and drinking single malt scotch is kind of the end of the road. Pinot Noir is that to a great extent, that potential complexity and the finesse and the elegance at the same time. 2020 vintage is really a spectacular vintage here. There was one great challenge, and I'll talk about that in a second, but 2020 vintage is a vintage that was just kind of, if I could program weather into a computer and have it delivered to a cluster of grapes, it would have been that. There were really no kind of really hard shocks in that year weather-wise. Towards the end of the season, we just had these beautiful conditions where, if you think about it like a tomato, all the flavors developed at the end. Same thing is true of a wine grape, is the flavors are there. But one of the great challenges with Pinot Noir is the thickness of the skin. When you get into warm conditions at harvest, I used to walk about 450 acres of vineyard from Mondavi down in the Carneros region of Napa. And oftentimes, first thing in the morning during a hot spell at harvest and that, you'd get out of your car to get ready to go walk the vineyards and that, and you'd smell the perfume of the fruit, much like you smell blackberries in the summer in a creek bed or something like that. And the challenge is, in the case of wine, we want to trap that. So we're not trapping that in the fruit and putting it in the bottle of wine. So the same thing is true with Pinot Noir. So that's part of the magic of Oregon, is that latitude where it's cooler in the fall tends to trap that perfume in there so that we can actually capture and deliver it. And that's, you think about the perfume and the elegance of Oregon, that's exactly where that comes from. So 2020 vintage was that. Now I said there was a challenge. That challenge was fires. We all remember the fires of 20. And I bring this up because they say the definition of a connoisseur is somebody who knows the difference between what they like and what's good. And 2020, there's some wines kind of marred by the conditions from fire and that. But the interesting thing is this was actually picked, this wine was picked the morning before the fire started. And so that's one of the unique things about Umpqua Valley. You looked at the Pinot Noir that was here. Everybody had brought their Pinot Noir really in before the state. And you look at the Willamette in particular was hit later within days or weeks of where we picked. And so that's kind of knowing the complexities and kind of the fine characters of fine wine and understanding. So with that, I want to take it for a little spin. Everybody likes different vintages. So when I say 2020 is a very classic, that's for what I like and we like, which is kind of that old world style of finesse and elegance, wines that are somewhat, I've been using this word for years, but the transparency where you can almost see through it. It's so delicate, but you get all these beautiful flavors and textures, and that really is the magic of Pinot. So, yeah. A couple of things. First and foremost, I get at the same time, which usually you look at like flavors. Flavors will come at you kind of one after the other, and that I get two things. One is I get this kind of beautiful, kind of like very, very mature, soft. I wouldn't say cherry, but kind of red fruit character. And right alongside that is a sweet spice character. A little bit of that probably comes from the grape, but some of that comes from the barrel. There's a particular barrel that I use on Pinot Noir that tends to give you a little bit of like a cherry highlight, almost like pitted cherry, kind of like a tightness and a structure to it, but also a little bit of like a sweet spice, and that comes from the type of wood, where it's aged, how the inside of the barrel's fired prior to making of the barrel. So, and just gentle, no alcohol. A lot of, you look at a latitude or you look at a warmer vintage, and that lower latitudes tend to give you a lot higher sugar, higher alcohol. There's nothing. It's just this fresh, bright character with just that sweet wood at the end. It's super beautiful. So. Very, very gentle. We talk about architecture in wine. Some wines you want it to come across the palate, be very deep in the middle, not kind of hit the sides. This Pinot Noir has volume. It's almost like turning the music up, in that you get this volume and this kind of weight, but you also get the acidity at the same time. We age this wine on the skins before we press it off at fermentation, 28 days. And so what that gives you is that gives you these very fine tannins. There's tannins on here, but they're super, super fine in the front. And the length I'm getting now, so it's just starting to kind of fade away right now, which is fairly long for a wine. This perfume, I still get it. You'll notice that acidity, backsides of the tongue, that freshness and that brightness, and that's part of that classic color. So something very beautiful, still very, very young. A wine, I use the analogy of flowers, that this is kind of like a rosebud that's kind of half cracked open. So in time, we expect to see this wine really do some beautiful things in the bottle as well. But I think one of my probably top 2 or 3 vintages that I've experienced here in Oregon in 20 plus years. Okay, moving on to our international selection this month. This is a winery that we featured one of their wines 3 years ago now, I think. And it's a wine that really hit me. I was at a tasting, and the prior wine was at the 20 vintage. And the 20 vintage there was not really hot, but it was very typical of what you see in Provence, southeastern France. This is where the Alps kind of drop down right in between, actually, Marseille and Montpellier, and so right on the French coast, and that kind of next to the Italian border. And it's a very warm area. A lot of Grenache is grown, Syrah, Mourvedre, those are the classics. This wine also has a little bit of Cab and a little bit of Carignan, old Spanish variety, in it. But the 20 I presented, and that wine had this beautiful warmth and this kind of what they call garrigue, the smell of many of the balsam plants that grow there, such as like rosemary and thyme and that. And it was very indicative, super beautiful. But when you tasted it, you tasted the way you taste a peach, and you get that softness and that sweetness and that roundness in like a warm year ultra ripe peach. It was like that. The 21 vintage is equally as stunning. The amazing thing is the 21 vintage is cooler, and the wine has this kind of linear character to it, so it kind of changes the architecture. So instead of being kind of softer and warm, it really kind of cuts, but it's got beautiful acidity, and it really kind of pops out of the glass, and it's a very, very different kind of beast. And so I had at this tasting, I bought some of it and drank it, and liked the last bottle and the second case as much as the first bottle that we had. But I want to share this with you, and those of you that remember that wine, the Mas de Gourgonnier, it'll be interesting to see that difference. And so that's kind of range within a winery. And so I talk about styles of wine and vintages and that. And so like we tend to like a little bit kind of cooler or more moderate vintages. A lot of people like a lot of heat, dry conditions that give you this power and kind of a chunky chewiness to it. So once again, finesse, as a general rule, the way you go from white wine to red and sweet to dry, you go from power to elegance. And I think that's that elegance that we look for, a lot of flavor, but in a real gentle delivery. Much deeper kind of black fruit than the Pinot Noir, which is what we would expect. Sometimes Grenache, which is the base of this, is about 40% Grenache, can be kind of sweet smelling. This is not at all. This is more black fruit. I'd say almost in kind of like a Merlot kind of character in the nose. greater weight to the wine, more phenolics. This has, as I mentioned, the Grenache. Grenache in this area can be a little bit like orange rind, that white pith on there, that kind of, you get the tannins, but you get a little bit of almost like a grapefruit kind of character to it. And this has that, which is very beautiful with food in particular, but very fresh from an area that usually makes very warm, soft wines. So something super delicious. I think about like roast lamb or something with a wine like this would be really spectacular. So I hope you enjoy that, and I hope that you can remember, if you were part of the club then, you can remember kind of what that other vintage tasted like, the 20, and kind of compare the two. To finish up with Chenin Blanc. Chenin Blanc in the 70s was massively successful and popular in America. That was pre-Chardonnay. There were only a couple hundred acres of Chardonnay in California. You get into the early 60s and that people were drinking Chenin Blanc the way they drink Chardonnay today. Internationally, people were drinking the wines out of the Loire. So Chenin Blanc is best known in the Loire, which is the valley that runs out to the Atlantic west of Paris, and it runs west in that. And we've seen like the Chinon that we produce. You see Cabernet Franc, Malbec, Gamay in that. But the two varieties that really were on top of a pile, if you go back into the 70s and that, were the Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc. So Chenin Blanc would be Vouvray, which is kind of the commune or the region that it would be labeled as, or Sauvigny, and then Puy-Fumé and Sancerre would be Sauvignon Blanc. So those wines were like incredibly, incredibly successful. Oregon, Richard Summers here at HillCrest planted Chenin Blanc. It was one of the dominant varieties. There were a few people in the area making it. Over time, that kind of faded away. Jancis Robinson, who's one of the greatest wine writers of all time, in that she says that Chenin Blanc is the French answer to German Riesling. It's one of the most diverse grapes in the world. It's a variety that can do like dry, full-bodied wines. It can do sparkling wine. There's a massive industry in the Loire Valley of sparkling Chenin Blanc that goes around the world in that. But it can also do great sweet wines. I'm one of my favorite producers in Burgundy. He collects, not Burgundy, but he collects the great sweet wines out of the Loire made from Chenin Blanc. So Chenin Blanc is this variety. It's super vigorous. You got to kind of control it. It's sauvage, but it can produce like these kind of medium to full-bodied wines. It's susceptible to botrytis. It's high acid, and so it has this incredible range. The only place outside of France today that it really is a hammer is South Africa, and the South Africans have been growing it since the 1600s, where it's known as Steen. And of all the wines I've had in South Africa, both in country and having the wines here and that, it is the variety without a doubt that best represents South Africa to me. Super beautiful, elegant, and that fresh and bright. So anyway, this is our very first Chenin Blanc, and we'll take our first spin. I know what it tastes like. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, it's got this beautiful, almost like a muskmelon, cantaloupe, perfume, fruity. Not sweet, but in terms of like sticky, but just this beautiful kind of bright, fresh. You can smell the acid. I mean, Chenin Blanc's famous for its acidity. That's the reason it makes great sweet wines and great sparkling wines. And I can just smell it. I'm salivating in anticipation of tasting it. But this is fermented in a 400-gallon Bodhi, some of those larger oak casks that we brought in from Italy, and left on the lees, which gives you this kind of this yeasty richness in the palate. So. Very tight. It's got the sweet kind of minerally, appley, almost kind of character to it, but still tight. That acid really kind of shows through. Killer food wine, great cheese wine. I think about, in the summer when we're having, chicken and fish and this kind of thing. I still salivate. It's just got a lot of acidity and a lot of it's malic acid, which, in European whites you tend to see malic acid, which is this green apple acid that just makes you salivate. Oftentimes in America we pick much later the whites, so they're high in what's called tartaric acid, which is like citric acid that's kind of sharp, not as gentle, pleasing, and kind of titillating. But anyway, I get a little bit of like a clove spice too on the back end of this, which is very interesting. It's not what I usually associate with Chenin Blanc, but maybe that's a fingerprint of Umpqua Valley. I don't know. So anyway, with that, as always, I'd like to say thank you so much for supporting our family's dream. We'd worked a lot of places in the world and decided to come here to Umpqua because of the power of the nature and its people. And so we feel very honored to be able to share our wines, and the support you provide us is important to that. Otherwise, it'd be too much much wine to drink. So with that, I'd like to say to the genie in the bottle, cheers and happy Thanksgiving.